Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to this Monday Minute Live Chat hosted by the Canadian Leadership Congress. Today, we're talking about how asset owners can become data-centric investors. And here to talk about it all, I have Darcie James Maxwell, who is Lead Architect Client Data Solutions with CIBC Mellon and BNY Mellon, and Danny Luck, Director of Data Management at IMCO. Welcome, both of you. So my first question is, I'd like to know how the data landscape has evolved over the last couple of years from an investor standpoint. Is the data set expanding, and what does that mean for asset owners? And let's start with you, Darcie.
Sure. So I always like to tell people when I first started my career, I started out by typing in benchmark data into a weighing terminal so that consultants can do some data analysis. So I would say that the concept of the need for data has not changed. The size and the scope of what people are looking for has significantly. So when we look at things, whether it be instrument coverage changes, data domains that are now being side by side, whether I want to see my performance and my risk to ESG and other data elements all together. But we're also now going away from just give me all my data to what does the data look like? Is it fit for purpose, and does it have the sufficient quality, is my opinion.
Great. Danny.
Yeah, so I think what's really changed is investors' expectations for data. And that comes across in the terminologies that we use. In the past, we like to report on data. So we want to report our findings. And then we move to analyzing the data. So we would establish a hypothesis and use data to test or validate. But nowadays, we want to interrogate the data. We want to question the data. We want the idea or the data to generate ideas for us and really tell us things that we might not have thought of. And what the real implications on the data sets is, when you're just reporting on data, you're really looking at your portfolio holdings. When you're analyzing data, you're looking at targeted data sets. But when you really want to interrogate data, you're looking at any potentially relevant data sets. So you're definitely working with much more vast and an expansion of data sets. But that also results in opportunities to more fully utilize data in the investment decision process.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit. So when it comes to technology and data, let's look at quality. How hard is it to access good investment data, and what are the challenges you see in that? Danny, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I look at data in different ways. So as Darcie has mentioned, there are different data domains. When we look at our core investment data, our positions, our transactions, our securities, the quality has always been there and will always need to be there, because you need a level of rigor in terms of controls to ensure that everything is complete and of the highest quality that can be utilized for your reporting. But when we move into more of the analytics and alternative data sets, it seems like the emphasis is more on the volume over the quality, or let me put it another way. Perhaps the tolerance for data quality questions associated with that data is higher. So, but that's very natural, because in the data space, every time there's any new strategies or new areas of interest, you have to start with the demand. And with the demand, then there will be increased supply. And ultimately, with increased supply, there will be increased and stronger governance over that supply of data.
Yeah, that's a good point. Darcie.
I was just going to say, just to add to that, is that when you think about those new data domains, whether it be alternatives or some of those emerging asset classes, the sources are very unknown. In some cases, you're crossing across paper trails of information to gather that together. And then how do you get that consistency across those data sources? So how do you do the analysis that, Danny is very rightly people are asking for? That's where a lot of the challenges comes from. Where am I sourcing it from? How am I curating it? How am I making sure that it has quality. So there's going to be a variation there, and that's not quite at the level of consistency where we would have probably developed that over years. We'll say something like an equity security master record. We kind of know what to do with it, right? So I think that's where some of those changes are still being defined and worked out.
Yeah, and when it comes to different investment areas, does that work differently? Like, for example, ESG or versus equities versus fixed income. Is there a data quality difference across some of these other asset classes? Darcie.
I'm nodding my head because yes. So we start off, let's take ESG. It's the hot topic of the day. We have all of our clients wanting to talk about ESG data. But when you look at ESG data, where are you sourcing it from? There's multiple different providers of the underlying source, and they use a different taxonomy. How they define that data is different. And so what are you trying to achieve with it? Are you simply want to put that data in from a reporting perspective to say that it's there for visual, it's there for consumption, or are you truly trying to tie it to an investment decision and an analysis? Because that level of data that you need from an ESG perspective, aligning it with your performance, the way you broke down your asset classes, that will look a little differently. And I think there's a lot more challenges that still need to be worked out through that. A number of places are looking at how do I, try to streamline it, and it could be compare from this source to this source. This equals the same thing. How do we do those data definitions?
Yeah, Danny?
Yeah, so I think it's a difference in maturity. So across the different data domains, there's different levels of maturity that each domain has reached. For a newer area such as ESG, if we kind of take a step back, the challenges that it presents is really a lot of some similar challenges as we've dealt with in the data space in the past, right? Every time something is new, it means whether it's a new focus area, a new strategy, or a new regulation, you're looking at data that you perhaps may not have worked with before, or you're trying to look at data in different ways. And a function of it being new, it means it's evolving. And a lot of times it's evolving by the minute. So a lot of times, the minute you develop a data solution, the requirements would have changed. But in that type of environment, what I like to do is, take a step back and look at our foundation, right? Do we have a strong foundation in terms of our data architecture, our operating model, such that we have the agility and flexibility built in to support change and to support the new data domains? And if you do, then it's really just utilizing the avenues and the channels that you've constructed to source data from your data suppliers or your partners, having the right data model that can handle and host data sets that are known and unknown, and also having the support structure in place to monitor the data quality associated with that content. So right now with ESG, I think that's what's happening, where the industry is evolving and really revolving around that focus area. So from a data perspective, we're trying to keep pace with that evolution.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I want to pick up on that and ask you, how difficult is that to do? I mean, we're talking about different models and processing for making the most of this, but really, how hard is it to take that data and put it to good use? Darcie?
I'll tell you, there's a new operational, not really new actually, operational metrics that many of our clients are looking at. What's the time to market for data onboarding? So as Danny mentioned, it's always going to change. There's something else after ESG that's just going to get exciting. And how do we get that in and get it into the process and get into the hands of the users? And I think the challenge is still be on where is the data being sourced, and what Danny had alluded to on that operating model. So you have to be able to have a construct where you have where are you going to store that data, who's going to have the data governance and operations of that data, and those rules that you apply to that have to be flexible to be able to say, take this rule I've defined and apply it to a new data set, and not constantly start from scratch. What we do see though is that some of these new alternative areas, it's just the normalization of that data is where the challenge is. And also from a talent, because in many cases, we have resources that are not necessarily equipped to understand and how to develop the solutions and the processes to be able to do that. So there is a resource change that's also evolving when it comes to data management in terms of who you need on your team, who can help to make sure that that time to market for onboarding data is going to be as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on the talent challenge in just a moment. But first, Danny, I just want to get your perspective from an asset owner on that. You know, putting data to good use.
Yeah, so Darcie's captured on everything in terms of people, process, and technology, right? But I think as asset owners as investors and myself as a data professional support in that area, a lot of times the challenge we see is associated with the cost benefit trade-off, especially when you're entering a new space, thinking about analytical data and alternative data. They're expensive, right? They're expensive to buy, they're expensive to create, they're expensive to maintain. And a lot of times you won't necessarily know whether it translates into actual value. So you're kind of stuck, right? Is we want to explore this data set, but are we certain that we want to incur the spending, and will we be able to recover that in the form of investment returns, right? So fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, given there is significant interest in this area, a lot of vendors have noticed as well, and they're really making developments and progress to help with that onboarding time and onboarding costs, as Darcie has mentioned. So I think over time, you're going to see even more creative uses of this data as it becomes more available and accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and I certainly, again, picking up on this, this idea of investors leaning more on data to tell them things that they hadn't thought about before. You made that point, Danny, and I really liked it. How do you report this? Right. So how do you make sure everybody kind of understands the potential for the data across your organizations and ensure it's being used effectively across the teams? Is that a challenge, Darcie?
It definitely is. And I would say that clients are looking for, how do I define the cost of ownership for data? Is it really something that I can trace back to the investment decision? Can I say that I've gained so many basis points of additional return because I had access to this particular information? And then I can correlate that to the cost of curating and ingesting that information. So that full data lineage is going to be very important to know where you're getting it from and how does that go to the end state. And we see that clients are still struggling with this. I'm going to use examples of Bloomberg data, which is quite commonly used for a number of different points in time, but many organizations may pull Bloomberg data in multiple areas of their organization, and they don't necessarily keep on top of it. And what they start to see is that those costs of that data access and that data distribution are increasing continually. And they need to be able to bring those costs down because it then impacts other areas and other potential investments that they can make. So there's I don't think any perfect solution for it. I do think that clients need to make sure that they're investing in the time to have a data governance and understand what is that lineage of all the data that directly impacts the investment process. You know where it's coming from. You know where the costs associated with collecting that information and monitoring it and maintaining it on a go forward. So unfortunately, some organizations are not quite there yet, because they still have to get their hands around who's using what. And so there's still, I think, a lot of analysis that still has to go on in this area.
That's great. I think the cost analysis is really, really interesting and an important part of this discussion. Danny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to focus on a very specific part of your question, which is how is being used effectively? How do we ensure data can be used effectively across the organization and across the plan? And I like to use an analogy that I often use with my team. I was like, imagine you have a weather app, right? It's actually not that bad of a situation if you open the app and you don't see anything. It's a little worse if your app is telling you that it's sunny outside, but it's actually raining. But imagine a situation when all your family members are getting different weather forecasts when they open their app. That's our reporting challenge right now, right? Like, how do you ensure that you have an investment report with a performance report, with a risk report, and they're all internally consistent? As Darcie has mentioned, this is kind of a matter of data governance, right? And it goes, in my opinion, much deeper than technology. It's really establishing that data culture. How do you get to a state where when there's a business user and they have a data need, they avoid their instinctive reaction to, hey, I'll just do something quickly to solve it myself, right? How do we break down silos, which is discussed in many forums, but I find the hardest part is to keep those silos from creeping up again, right? So how do you ensure that there's with the lack of really, explicit coordination across all the teams, that everyone has that data awareness so that they can tie everything together to your data strategy and ultimately enforce that communal element of consistency across the organization. So I find that's a big challenge.
Darcie, I can't, you're nodding, especially around this tension between silos and sort of communal use of the data. Is that something you have conversations with clients about?
I would say there's probably at least a weekly conversation, and it always brings up my favorite topic that, the financial services industry is built on Excel. And what ties to exactly what Danny's talking about is, that temptation. I have an Excel spreadsheet. I'm going to pull in data from multiple different sources, but now my data lineage, my data controls around that is now lost. And so how do you make sure that there is that data awareness and respect for the source of where that data may be and where it's being used, to make sure that there are the right controls and culture to be able to manage that. So I'm definitely nodding what Danny's saying, because it's a common problem that has not been solved. No matter, it's not a technology challenge. We can give you the technology tools to be able to facilitate that, but you really have to have the operational awareness around that data usage and how that lineage and quality is important.
Yeah, and I like what I liked, no, I absolutely agree. And I'd like to add to that. It's because like a lot of organizations, they think that, oh, you just need to put in a data governance policy on day one and that solves your problem. But a lot of times these organizations find out it's very difficult to enforce what you put into the policy. I kind of look at data governance as relationship building, right? You have to first work with your business functions to demonstrate value, to build confidence, so that the business stakeholders can relate to the experience and be willing to go on this data journey with you. In a sense, you're really building data into the DNA of the organization's most valuable asset is people. And as I mentioned earlier, it really goes beyond focusing just on the technology. It's really instilling that culture so that everyone believes in it and everyone can support it across the organization.
Yeah, people and culture are big topics right now. And when it comes to finding talent, particularly in this area and around technology, it's a very, very competitive field to get the people that can really do this. What skill sets are needed for this to help asset owners become really good data-driven investors? Darcie, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start. And I think there's a couple of things to think about. We have to recognize that there's actually multiple disciplines involved here. There is an understanding of data domains, data attributes, business knowledge of how that data is being used in the organization. But there's also that ability to a technology sort of aspect of how do you maximize the tools that you have to be able to, support that data culture. And so from a resource perspective, when I'm looking to hire team members to join my team, I'm actually looking for people who ideally would be doing data analysis type of activities today, but I'm really looking for people who understand how data can be valued and how it can be used. So their skill sets in their past may be in functions that might have been either front office, middle office, or even back office, because they're managing some type of data and understand the value and who's going to be using that data. I can teach some of the technology components to it, but it's really that historical access and interaction with data is what I'm looking for. Set. It is challenging to find because it is a high value area resource. I mean, you look at a number of organizations and they do recognize that this is a gap. Having someone who understands data, how to also understand data governance, and then also understand the technology to be able to maximize that and leverage that across, that's almost as traditionally that would have been 3 different people. And we're looking for it in one in many cases. And so it's a diverse type of resource skill set that is challenging to find.
Danny?
Yeah, like I don't know if you would call it a skill set, but I value creativity. And from a team perspective, creativity is a function of diversity. So if we bring on experienced hires, they can bring a lot of wisdom that helps us set a good foundation. But you also want bright young minds that can teach you to think outside the box, right? So that you can really generate and create agility for your organization. Having the right mix of people with different backgrounds, with different experiences, allows you to match the profile of the stakeholders and the clients that you're servicing. That may sound very obvious, that of course diversity is important, but how many times have we seen or we've posted job posting that says, hey, I need 7 years of capital markets experience, I need post-secondary education in a business or finance related area. But if you ask me, like if there's a candidate that came from one of our tech giants and expressed interest in the capital markets, I'd be so excited to see what they would bring to our industry. Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's look a little bit about the role of data and some of the technology that supports us within the larger organization. Asset owners and pension investors in particular, very focused on resiliency, and agility generally for the organization. How can you, both as technology experts, support that effort to create a resilient and potentially future-proof organization? How do you keep on top of that, Darcie?
It's a very good question and a difficult one to answer because there's so many different components to it. But I actually want to go back to something that Danny mentioned earlier, was that creativity. I think that if you take strategic thinking and that ability to be very creative, and then on top of that, that ability to be flexible and agile, take all of those components. And I think that's what we're looking for and we're working with clients to do today, is because what a client might define as their today problem doesn't necessarily solve it for them in 6 months or a year, because things are constantly changing. So we need to think about what is that longer term data strategy. And I think all of those components kind of come into play. How do you be flexible? How do you think about what's the strategic structure of your data organization, and how it may not be a single technology solution that you need to do. Maybe it's a service provider that you need to be able to integrate together. So you need to be able to, almost like a puzzle, put the pieces together that's going to give you a roadmap that's going to go out for at least a couple of years.
Yeah, Danny. Yeah, and Darcie's right. It is a very difficult question to answer, but I think we have to accept that change is the norm. It's the new normal, right? So, but at the same time, does change really affect the outcomes or the objectives that you're trying to achieve? So for example, within my data management function, if my objective is to connect data provisioners with data consumers, I should be able to connect them if they're both in the office, if they're both remote, if one is in the office and one remote, right? At the same time, if one of our objectives is make sure that our investment professionals, our business stakeholders have data at their fingertips, right? So whether it's yesterday with a core investment data set, today with a analytical data set, tomorrow with an ESG data set, we should be able to deliver on that objective. So in a sense, the resiliency should be built in and factored in as a requirement to structure in your objectives.
Yeah, and building on that, you touched on the investment space. How do you have to kind of think ahead and look into the future a little bit in your role as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. As whether it's data professionals or technology professionals, I think we need a lot of curiosity, and we need to be good listeners. Like, we need to really jump up from our help desk or get out of our little technology bubble and really look to take interest in understanding our organizational objectives, our investment roadmap, so that we can really truly partner with our business stakeholders and learn how they're thinking. Because a lot of times when a need comes up, it's already too late to start planning a solution. So you want to really develop a relationship with them, really understand how they're thinking, where they're heading, so that when they have a new idea or when the next idea comes up, you already have the preparation that's already been made in order to enable that and the execution of that idea.
Yeah, Darcie.
What I was going to say is that, as I was thinking along when Danny was talking, is that when we talk to clients and we see the perspective across multiple organizations, and they say, we want to talk about our building a 5-year roadmap. And sometimes my answer is, quite frankly, if you spend 2 or 3 weeks or 3 months building that roadmap, it's going to be stale by the time the ink is dried on that. What you really need to understand is, what is that table stakes foundational things that are going to be able to be the building blocks that's going to help you down the road. And to Danny's point, it has to be not just about what you're doing today, is not just about even what this organization's doing, it's what is your colleagues out in the industry doing? What are your comparative peers doing? Where do we see some trends? Making sure that you're getting those outside perspectives that you can then take internally and say, well, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? Have we, what happens in the worst case scenario that, the market goes down significantly? What happens in this type of scenario? Does the foundational pieces that we've put on the table as our structure and our operating model, could that sustain through it? Could that be flexible enough to adjust if something does occur? And so I think definitely that perspective of outward looking and bringing that perspective inward is going to be key for many organizations, because the challenges are not unique to any one organization. It's consistent across. We hear a lot of the same concerns and challenges. And so there's a lot to be able to share to be able to solve it collectively.
And one of the big focus areas right now, of course, is sustainable investing, ESG investing. And I'd love to get your perspective on the role of data in supporting an ESG investing strategy. How important is it? And are there any particular gaps that you're working to overcome? And Danny, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned in the response to an earlier question, I think the key challenge with the attention on ESG right now is because it's new, because it's evolving. A lot of times, by the time we're working out a solution and trying to create an architecture to support it, the industry has moved forward, right? Like, guidelines have changed, requirements have changed. So back to what Darcie has mentioned, it's so important to build that flexibility and agility into your architecture and into your operating model, such that regardless of the change or the different flavors of data that's ultimately required to enable successful integration of ESG into your investment decisions, you would be able to support those business functions, again, from a data and technology perspective.
Yeah, Darcie.
One of the questions that we ask our clients when it comes to ESG is, what's your intent with this information? Are you going to, start your investment decisions and what attributes you're looking at as the next asset class based on those ESG factors? Or are you using it more as a compliance, a post-trade compliance type of question? So is it meant to be at the beginning of the chain or at the end? And sometimes those questions are going to be different depending on what the mandates are and the strategy. But depending on what that is what the data requirements are going to look like. If I need it to be right up front, that means there's a certain user community that needs that data right up front. It needs to be in a certain format. I need to look at where the sourcing is to align with the mandate and the strategy, versus if I'm doing it for more of a validation check at the end of the process, it might need to look at a different way. So in many cases, we're trying to say, what is the use case? Is it, to take the box that I have ESG as part of my report? Or is it really part of the factor in that investment decision process? And if we can get the answer to those, then that helps to drive how we deal with it from a data perspective, because it is a new data set. It is not normalized. It's not necessarily consistent across data vendors. And what you don't want to do is invest a lot of operational time and it's not used as effectively as it should be, depending on what was used for. So that cost of curating as well is to be factored in based on what is the use case.
That's a really good point. I guess my last question for both of you is looking ahead a little bit. And maybe this is a hard question to answer, but can you give me like what you see as the top technology opportunity that's right in front of asset owners right now that they should be focusing on, perhaps after they listen to this Monday Minute? And if you could suggest that, what would it be? Danny, I'm going to make you answer that one first.
Great. Okay, so let me think for 20 seconds. No, but okay. So, and I'm going to lean on my experience. So, like, I've worked in a lot of organizations, and most organizations I've worked in, it always seems like there's a real strong distinction between investment data and corporate data. It's like there's a line in between, and thou shalt not cross, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity in integrating that data. Again, back to the theme of breaking down silos, breaking down barriers, right? So if you look at something simple that we discussed about earlier, right? Cost is important, cost matters. How do you integrate fee and analytics into your investment decisions? But how do you even broaden that such that you're not only considering the fees and costs associated with your investment process, but perhaps also with your support model? So you have an investment strategy. It could be executed with 3 people, 5 resources, 10 resources, and they might generate different outcomes. So how do we ensure that we recognize and use data to assess those different outcomes, and perhaps even change the conversation so that I'm not raising my hand and saying that, hey, I needed 3 resources because there's more work, but we're executing this new investment strategy that's generating great returns because we've hired 3 resources based on the modeling that we've done. So I find it, pretty exciting that let's really see what data is capable of, right? Let's not just limit ourselves to looking at investment data in isolation or corporate data in isolation. Let's really mix it up and try to combine the two and see how it generates more information that allows our organization to make better decisions.
That's great. Darcie.
Yeah, definitely a difficult question, because we touched on so many of those that I would think of, like data governance, data quality. I think the one that I would use, and I actually got this from a client recently, where they said to me, don't ask me what data I want all my data. And I want to make all of it available to everybody. I don't want to ask anymore, do I want 5 fields, 10 fields? I want 1 source, 2 source. I want access to data, and that's going to be all encompassing. Can you define a model that will be able to meet that need? And at the time I went, that seems so different. We usually start off with, what do you want? What's your requirements? Give me the 10 things that you need. But in the course of the conversation, what it did come out with is, here's the opportunity to think of things differently. what if I had the opportunity to pull my data and not necessarily move it from one system to the other? I'm going to leverage new technologies that allows data to stay in its location, but still aggregate it together. And then it becomes limitless as to what access do I have. So I think data availability and that, I would say, revising our thought process of how we methodically define what data sets we make available, I think is going to be a very exciting opportunity across the board, because I want to be able to answer those clients that says, don't tell me what I want, don't ask me what I want, just give me everything.
Oh, and on that note, this is a great place to wrap up this fantastic discussion. Thank you both for your comments. I think they're going to be really helpful for everyone who signs in today. And that wraps this week's Monday Minute. Don't forget to send us your questions and we'll get right back to you with our speaker's response. They will be on hand for the next while and watching out for any questions you have. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Darcie, for your time today and your insights. And thank you all for joining us, and see you next time.
Great. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.